Welcome to a background to the maths of empathy. I want to give you a bit more background to all that I'm talking about, all the science that I'm talking about in this video, called Mathematics for Social Interactions between two people, active inference. First chapter. So it starts off like this.
So to understand social human behavior in
Okay, so I will go through the 7 parts of this video and just give you an overview and background to each. So I start off by asking, where is consciousness? Where is consciousness? So before moving, I give a definition of phenomenology. Phenomenology is everything that we can consciously sense. So I give the example of a video. That's why I'm just shooting here this forest. It's basically what you're sensing, what you're viewing, what you're hearing. Okay, phenomenology. So in order to understand consciousness, you have to incorporate phenomenology. So the very first aspect chapter I go into is called things within things.
sensing it.
But, essentially, we can talk about the human body as a nested Russian doll of many processes. Like, you have from the cellular activity to all the way the human body, organs, and all the way to consciousness. So here I give example of even electrical activity at the cellular level happens and go on all the way up to the brain activity, to movement. And so that is the type of complexity we are dealing with, things within things. Um, then I go into the principles that are used, the mathematical principles used to model consciousness. The first aspect is that of a boundary. And so it's very simple, the idea. We call this
It's the internal.
a Markov blanket in the active inference framework. Markov blanket is a mathematical concept that describes a boundary. Okay, why do we want to put a boundary? Well, um, you will see that we can consciousness is a private thing, right? There's a subjective aspect. That means it is an internal aspect, and which is different to the external, and therefore there is a boundary you can put between subjective internal and external environmental. You you will see later on that you can also do the same as seen in here between the unconscious and the conscious. So like the Freudian iceberg. So the Markov blanket is a mathematical tool to put a boundary, as you can see here. Um, Basically, in a Markov blanket, you have a parent node that affects your current state, P0, which goes on to affect its children nodes, as it's called, CH1 and CH2. And the P1s and CP1s are the Markov blankets. There are other ways of doing this. It's using the holographic principle that we will go into more detail later on. Now, we can talk about blankets also between the different levels. There are scales to the human body. As I mentioned earlier, things within things. So you can see these lines represent the boundaries between each scale. You can think of it as cellular, organ, nervous system, whole body, environment, right? These are the different boundaries you can put within a living organism. Now, to model a living organism, you have to take in consideration 3 principles about physical systems. The first one is that 2 different um, components of a physical system, such as this, represented with these dots put together, 2 of them perceive or interact with the world differently, which is why we put the unequal sign. Okay. Then second point, any component,
experiences the environment like the whole system.
you see, any small component is not going to interact in the same way as the overall system. Okay? And then finally, the overall system does not interact with the environment as do the small components. So there is a hierarchy of bottom level stuff, smaller scales, in global scales, local scales, etc. Now, I talk here about the integrated information theory by Giulio Tononi, and this theory allows to quantify the complexity level of a physical system that should give rise to a phenomenological experience, and therefore you can quantify the level of phenomenological complexity of experience. And it has all to do with the global um, entity. Okay, so here you can see a very complex looking Lego system, and it's the whole Lego system together can be quantified with what is called the phi variable. And there are a few different. There are 4 characteristics for quantifying
Conscious structure.
Such physical systems. So you see here I'm talking about cause effects. So, excuse me. The causal effect, the cause effect power is what we're calling phi, this variable. So the cause effect power is how much a physical system can be affected by others and make a difference to others or other parts of the environment. That's principle number 1. It's cause effect power. Principle number 2, it should be capable of applying its cause effect power to itself as well, such as changing emotional states. That's an example. Third principle is that any cause effect relationships are specific, and therefore the information needed between the cause and the effect is specific. Let's take an example. The example of a painter. A painter has to know certain color and perspective theories and knowledge and practices in order to paint uh, his picture. Whereas a finance analyst will need concepts of economy, data analysis, and mathematics. So whatever the context that needs to be acted upon is going to be specific. Okay? So the difference between the financial analyst and a painter. That's principle 3, information specific. Principle number 4 and final one is that the state in which the organism or the physical system is in is determined by the maximally descriptive information about that causal effect state. So if a person is in a financial building, it's more likely that they are doing financial analysis than painting a picture. Whereas if they were in a workshop, it would be different. So those are 4 principles that are used to define complexity. Okay, let's go a bit more into the next steps, which is defining what is interacting. What does it mean to interact with an environment? So I go into the idea of predictive brain theory, which means that which states that the brain is constantly predicting what's going to happen sensorially, what's going to happen inside the body, and it does that with beliefs. It has a hypothesis. Oh, this is going to happen, and once it happens, it has to adapt to whatever the outcome actually is, what actually happens. And therefore, the error between, or the difference between its belief and what actually happened, is called the prediction error. Okay, and the goal of the organism is to update based on the error. Okay, so that's what I go into in here. And basically, it has to be the same principle when two people are interacting. Okay. Then I go into the idea that whatever you pay attention to, um, you synchronize it, your brain activity to it. So I can put it in other words. Um, if you're looking at something that's rhythmical, you're sensing it, like music, your brain is, if you're paying attention to it, is going to replicate the frequencies of that musical piece. So this is the case for practically everything. It's kind of a empirically based principle. And I've made another video about empirical evidence that I'm putting on here that you can watch. One example, if you can't think about, well, not everything can be described in terms of frequencies. Think about watching a film. That is not necessarily just frequencies. Well, you can argue that it is, but two people who are watching the same film have been proven to share the brain activity. You know, there are differences, individual differences, depending on what is meaningful to you. Between two individuals, there might be differences in what you're finding interesting. But in essence, if you are paying attention to the same thing, you will share that same brain activity. And so I mentioned this neuroscience, and it goes all the way up to the most abstract levels, which in terms of brain activity and brain regions, we can talk of the default mode network. Okay? And that's right. So different levels of self-awareness goes all the way down to the deepest layers of the cortex, which is the default mode network. And that's where most likely the conscious activity is represented in the brain. And that is because there are so many things, as mentioned before, that are out of our conscious activity. So here I go into a very basic introduction of the mathematics of belief updating. Um, let's say you have a belief, a hypothesis about, I think that you have a basketball and you're like, I'm going to throw it and it's going to bounce back because I've done that before. I've seen basketballs bounce. That's X. X is my belief. Now I throw it. And what's actually happening is that there wasn't any air inside the basketball. And so it just, boom, it does not bounce back. It just goes flat on the ground. That's why. Why here is what actually happened. And therefore, you have to go
Unexpected sensory input.
and make sure that what you were believing matches with what actually happened. So make your X become a Y. That's
Free energy
belief
crisp
updating.
or
Okay?
prediction describes to for an organism, and it is called active inference when it describes two humans interacting, such as Alfred and Boris.
So active inference is the idea of acting. It's just taking this idea of, I was talking about beliefs and um, you know um, yeah, beliefs, which is more perceptual, but you can take it all the way to acting. When you do a motor movement with your muscles, it is the same principle, but you're just moving instead. Okay, in this sixth part, I'm talking about energies. So I go into the idea that a living organism tends to reduce the amount of energy that it expediates or that it diffuses. And this idea of energy diffusing or dispersing is known as entropy. And so it does the negative of entropy. Now, I clarify here that although locally in the
still dissipates energy
in the organism, the entropy is reduced. The global entropy in the environment is constantly increasing. There's always going to be energy being dispersed, okay?
the
But the
environment,
organism can
thereby
manage that
increasing
energy
the
dispersion.
total entropy.
So it's always going to be true that the local entropy is equal or great or smaller than the
Of the
global
environment.
entropy. Okay.
Moreover, this
Secondly, I go into the idea that beliefs and the set of beliefs of someone can be described as gravity centers that represent habitual types of thinking, of believing, of acting. And that's why I talk about a gravity center. So, you're likely to go to this thoughts, to that movement. And so, an important thing is that the way these beliefs interact can be modeled in any geometrical way that's best adapted. And here are just poetically put different ways you can think about it. All belief systems can be just a tube map, or it can be a bit more complex, as you see there.
this is the case.
Okay, and now going into social models. Okay, so
Full environment. E.
what I'm saying here is that a social interaction happens within a social context or a social environment. Here I'm giving the example of the forest as E.
This is the
Okay,
observable environment.
then the interaction between two people, A and B, or Alfred and Boris, as I talk about it in this video, happens at a boundary, a shared boundary. Okay, we talked about boundaries before, boundaries being the difference between internal and external. Okay, and when there are two people interacting, they share a boundary.
The boundary by which all free energy
So the energy exchange between Alfred and Boris happens between all the shared boundary, okay, because they're sharing it. However, there's only a certain section of that boundary which is conscious, which is a shared attentional resource, shared attentional resources between A and B. And here denoted as an example is just a pink
would still
part.
be processed, but in the
All the rest of that boundary are processed in the background.
background,
Okay?
unconsciously, to maintain both systems' organization and form. Newell
Examples.
divides this boundary into equal points at
Yeah.
which energy exchange occurs.
So you can divide it in different parts, and then you just look at the parts which are consciously exchanged. And so then you can think about when someone's communicating and the other's listening, um, you can describe that as the one who's speaking or communicating as, he's dispersing energy, which you can talk about it as waste energy or thermal heat. Basically, you can use the physics equations of heat dissipation and heat waste for the communicator. You can talk about information being exchanged, whereas the listener is having a epistemological uh, epistem- epistemological experience. He's learning, right? There's information for him is feeding him. It's nutritional. Okay,
Threads as epistemic information gain or fuel,
fuel. I say. Okay, so that's one way of
and vice
describing
versa.
that. The exchange
Naturally,
of energy.
following the law of conservation of mass energy, the unchanging total energy.
Yes. So then you can describe total energy because we're talking about energy exchanges between A and B. There's a mathematical concept called the Hamiltonian by a guy called Hamilton, I think. Hamiltonian describes the total energy of the system, and to get the total energy of the shared boundary between A and B, you can simply take the social context's total energy minus the total energy of Alfred minus the total energy of Boris. Okay, and um, that will give you the energy exchange on the shared boundary. Now, this is a very simple way of going about it. This is just an overview. Now, one way of describing a Hamiltonian is that it is the movement energy and the potential energy. So, what's actually moving and what could happen in that context. Okay. And then I just remind you that we can describe boundaries between boundaries, or anything that resembles the concept of a Russian doll as Holarchies. Holarchies are holons within holons, and a holon is a state, a physical system, a system that is embedded within another system and that incorporates other systems. So I've got other chapters looking into further ways of incorporating these theories that I'm talking about. The next chapter, I haven't put it out yet, but I will put it out at some point, makes use of Ken Wilber's integral theory. And the integral theory is a way of categorizing human development, and I'm linking it with active inference. And so it's just it's another way of looking at applying the idea of boundaries within boundaries and hierarchies at the idea of human development. Okay. And so make sure to subscribe and like if you want to see what happens with that video. I do want to state that although this is an introductory mathematics to the belief updating and all that I mentioned here, there's another video that I've done about that goes a bit more in depth about the mathematics of belief updating and the free energy principle that's applied here, the predictive brain, and you can watch that there. That's all. I wanted to give you a bit more background to this video in case you needed it. And yeah, make sure to like, subscribe, share, and I hope to see you soon. Thank you so much for watching. All the best.